All right, hello. My name is Calvin Andrassi, and this is Intercultural Relations. And today we're going to be examining the concept of identity. So, what is identity, and how is it a reflection of the culture into which we have been born? And in what ways does it drive how we live our lives and the types of people with whom we associate and interact? Okay. So identity development plays a pretty significant role in the psychological well-being of an individual, but ultimately, what is identity? There's a lot of different potential definitions and propositions therein. Social scientists Judith Martin and Thomas Nakayama put it simply as the concept of who we are. Um, Academic Stella Ting Toomey developed face negotiation theory, and she suggested that identity is the reflective self-conception or self-image that we derive from our family, our gender, our cultural, ethnic, and individual socialization, and that basically identity refers to our reflective views of ourselves and our perceptions of others. So that is, I think, a pretty good basis for us to begin the discussion. Basically, identity is not simply a single entity, but in many ways is a fairly integrated set of concepts that operate based on the social situation or the context that we tend to find ourselves in. So, according to social identity theorist John Turner, one's identity can include a human, a social, and a personal dimension. Basically, the human identity is the perception of self that links a person to the whole of humanity as opposed to other life forms. Social identities are the result of being the member of a particular social group or being the non-member of others. And personal identities are what sets you apart from others in a group and mark you as special or unique. So, the study of identity and intercultural communication tends to focus on how identity influences and guides expectations about one's own and other social roles and provides guidelines for communicating with others. So, things like occupational identity really influences intercultural communication as well, because the role that you find yourself in is going to play a significant part in how you're going to be communicating with others um, within an organizational context. So think about this for a second. Think about how your family, your background, your ancestors, your traditions, your cultural heritage, perhaps your religion or your lack thereof, how does that influence your identity? How do your interests impact your identity? Your hobbies, your core values, the hard decisions that you've had to make in your life and your challenges and emotional and um, anything that's happened in your past, your educational background, significant life events, things like childbirth and deaths in the family and things like that. Your relationships and whether you felt any pressure to conform to social groups or to the community. These are all things that have shaped your personality and have shaped your values. You know, think about some of the basic ways that we go about looking at and classifying and categorizing and identifying other individuals. Are you extroverted or are you introverted? Are you aware of your strengths and weaknesses? How adaptive would you consider yourself to your environment? Has your sense of identity changed in any way over time? Have you ever lived in a place that's culturally different from your own? What about, situational identity? Do you behave differently with friends than you do perhaps at work or at school? These are kind of the notions of the uh, ways in which your identity can potentially play out. And this brings us to social identities as well. Your community that you were born into and that which you kind of elect to belong to constitute a large part of your identity as well. And while identity serves to kind of bind us to a larger group and makes us feel like a part of something bigger and more enduring, perhaps it can also isolate and even alienate us from other groups. So it's kind of important to understand where you come from in that regard, so that you can find yourself capable of dealing with different challenges that may make their way into your day-to-day intercultural communications uh, environment, and so that you can understand how you would anticipate potentially reacting under certain circumstances. So we're going to start with racial identity here, and it's a concept that kind of grew out of the 18th century European anthropologists who basically placed people into different categories based on outward appearance. Now, unfortunately, race is not necessarily a very well-defined concept. And in places like the United States, instead, we often interchangeably use the concept of an ethnic group, which is more of a reference to cultural similarities than necessarily outward appearance, to try to identify ourselves. So basically, where we fit in the context of our cultures, um, and our association, sometimes with individuals that may look something like us, or sometimes may deviate from that to a significant degree as well. Okay. Gender identity, meanwhile, is the socially constructed concept of how cultures differentiate between masculine and feminine social roles. Okay, so this is a little bit different from biological sex, but rather the things that manifest as being masculine or being feminine. For example, if I were to put on a dress and perhaps some makeup, that could lead to some potential difficulties for some individuals that would be confused by my choice to do that. Would that be an indication of uh, my associating with another gender, or perhaps even another sex? Is that a manifestation of transsexuality, or is that simply a desire to embrace some more feminine aspects while maintaining my masculine sexuality, right? So, if I were a man to wear a dress and have flowers in my hair and things associated with femininity, it could be a source of gender confusion, and in some cases, even open hostility, even today. Next up, let's talk a little bit about national and regional identity. So, many people associate their national identity, the nation where they were born, and they tend to identify with the characteristics of individuals that were born within that national context as well. So national identity can be acquired a number of different ways, of course, by birth, but also through immigration and naturalization, and perhaps also with cultural heritage to a significant degree. Individuals may be connected to another country through their parents, perhaps where their parents were born. They tend to have some degree of association with that country. I, for example, strongly identify with being an American, having been born and raised here, but with Hungarian parents and having spent many of my summers in Hungary, possessing dual citizenship with Hungary, I also have an affinity for the country and would consider myself Hungarian American in addition to being American. Um, Furthermore, regional identity, countries can often be further divided into different geographic regions, oftentimes with very varying cultural traits, often manifested through things like ethnicity and language, accents, dialects, customs, different foods from different areas, uh, different ways that people dress, and of course, historical or political legacies as well. So, various states, even cities and things like that in places like India or China can have very significant ethnic and language differences, as well as accents from one location to another. But even in places like the United States, like the Southern California culture that I was born into, um, there is an associated accent with that, and associated dress. Shorts and flip-flop sandals are sort of synonymous with the fashion sense. As a former Spanish and Mexican colony, California architecture and food are rather distinct and identifiable. You can get some really fantastic tacos around here. Furthermore, as the home of Ronald Reagan and Earl Warren and Arnold Schwarzenegger, as well as Jerry Brown, Nancy Pelosi, and Kamala Harris, one might be forgiven for making some assumptions about the political stance that a Californian might ascribe to as well. Okay. But in terms of other ways that you can identify yourself, organizational identity is a big thing. In many cultures, one's affiliation with different types of organizations, especially those organizations that are linked to their profession, might be particularly important. So, in Japan, business cards, the company and the individual's role within it are usually placed above the person's name itself. And that kind of contrasts with the United States, where perhaps the company name is at the top, followed by large, bold letters for the individual's name. And then maybe their position is listed in smaller type. As somebody who's in academia, the university with which one is affiliated is often of pretty significant importance as well. So, the fact that I have taught in the California State University system, at the California community colleges, as well as a number of different private institutions and nonprofit institutions like Stanford University, for which I am producing this content. That's all very important to some extent in expressing my identity, and I think in many ways conveys a lot of information about how I identify myself as a professional as well. Moving on from that, something that's become far more important in recent years is a person's cyber identity as well, or basically their fantasy identity. These are manifested and presented um, in a number of different ways, such as, for example, a person's screen name, and their gaming IDs, or other types of cyber personas that they may have. Oftentimes these personas may obscure or even eliminate some of the negative traits that individuals might possess, and kind of act as an imaginary persona that is not necessarily a true reflection of the person's actual opinions and positions and values and things like that, but nevertheless is an expression of how individuals identify themselves within the context of being online or in some sort of a cyber space. Okay. Now, moving right along, the idea of developing and acquiring identities is largely the product of the groups that a person is a member of. And chief among them, perhaps, is the family, right? But in addition to that, how you socialize and your personal experiences also may impact your identity. So the process of identity acquisition generally begins at a very, very young age, with family members teaching specific behaviors for girls and boys, or teaching, age appropriate behaviors, and the concept of, individual versus group based identities, right? I know that growing up, watching cartoons, for example, was associated with young people, although I will admit that Having grown up, I still enjoy watching my occasional cartoon now and again, right? Um, so Gene Finney, let's start with Gene Finney, a social psychologist that studied ethnic identity development and bicultural identity, identified several steps in acquiring one's identity, specifically regarding ethnicity, and that's been bolstered by the work of Martin and Nakayama, who I mentioned before. Um, and I think to a large extent, some of these processes might be something that can apply outside of the ethnic context as well. But we start with this notion of the unexamined ethnic identity, which individuals are unconcerned with their identity and are perhaps conforming to the dominant culture. And oftentimes, in that conformity, that might create a bit of a negative self-image because people are different from one another. And if you're of an ethnic background that is not the dominant culture, perhaps you see yourself as different and see yourself as a bit of a social outcast. Now, with increasing awareness of these differences and things, it extends into what is called an ethnic identity search. And individuals start to become interested in learning about and understanding their own culture and their own ethnicity. And through that exploration, individuals are then able to build a really clear and confident understanding of their own cultural identity in what is referred to as ethnic achievement. Now, in some instances, members of the dominant culture also become aware of the existing social inequities and situations that they might put individuals of non-dominant status into, and begin to question their own culture. And they might begin to increase their association with minority culture members. And with increased understanding of the dominant culture's identity, there may come an appreciation of minority cultures as well, resulting in redefinition and reintegration of many of the minority cultures. Okay. Now, specifically with biracial cultures, Martin and Nakayama suggest that there are three main phases of kind of gender, racial and ethnic identity acquisition. In that regard, the first phase, phase one, people become conscious of the differences in general and the potential for discord that may arise from being um, a member of multiple racial or ethnic groups. In phase two, they gain an awareness of their personal differences, such as with other children or individuals that they're associating with on a day-to-day basis. And then in phase three, they start to sense that perhaps they're not part of the norm and they don't quite fit in with the first racial or ethnic category that they identify with, and they might not necessarily fit in 100% with the other racial or ethnic category. And that's when they kick off that notion of identity exploration. And in the end, basically one establishes their cultural identity through things like rites of passage and ultimately it enacts an identity through the display of things like different types of clothing, perhaps a religious or spiritual identity, learning and the acquisition of the language associated with the cultures that they're a part of. Um, but also perhaps becoming involved in commemorative events that pertain to that culture. So why do we talk about this? Why do we think about this? Because in order to be able to communicate effectively in an intercultural situation, an individual's cultural identity and their things like their communication style should try to match the identity and the style ascribed to him or her by the other party. So communication styles are likely to be relatively different based on the cultures with which an individual might associate. So participants might have to search for a middle ground, and that search is going to require some degree of flexibility and adaptation. So, you have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of other people and, think about your own way in which you have explored your own cultural um, values and where you kind of fit in within the cultural context, and consider the ways in which other cultures might not necessarily mesh with basically the standard operating procedures of that culture. And of course, with globalization, that's really increased cultural diversity and has revived local cultural identities in, many different parts of the world. And so, having multiple cultural identities are starting to become far more commonplace. We have a globalized economy, a lot more immigration. Uh, Foreign travel is very easy. You can pretty much get anywhere else on the planet within about 24 hours for the most part. Communication technologies, of course, have significantly improved in the last few decades. And things like intercultural marriage are really bringing about an increasing mix of different cultures. And, mixing is producing people who possess multiple cultural identities. And the more aware that you are of those other cultural identities and what is considered normal in the communications process, in business, and in just interpersonal interaction, I think the better off you're going to be in being able to relate to the individual and essentially get things done through the communications process. All right. Well, thank you so much. That's all I really had to say for this week. I look forward to you coming to the next topic of discussion as well.